Four young men from Liverpool were once told they had no future in show business. Their drummer was fired 3 weeks before anyone had heard of them, and the man who replaced him arrived to chants of protest. They became so famous they could no longer hear themselves play. Their own audiences drowned them out completely. And one sentence from John Lennon, 9 words, spoken in a quiet newspaper interview, triggered bonfires of their records across America. These are not myths. These are the stories that actually happened. And some of them sound more unbelievable than anything a scriptwriter would invent. Before any of this, there was Liverpool, a club called The Cavern, and a band that could not get a record deal. Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison had been playing together since the late 1950s, genuinely talented. But talent in the music industry has never been enough on its own. What changed them was Hamburg. Between 1960 and 1962, they made 5 trips to Germany, playing clubs along the Reeperbahn for audiences who were there to drink, not to listen, up to 8 hours a night, night after night. In Liverpool, they had played polished 1-hour sets. In Hamburg, they had to keep going long after those sets ran out. They had to experiment, improvise, find new ways to hold a crowd. By the time they returned to England, they had transformed, not just as musicians, but as performers who could hold any room, anywhere, for any length of time. Back in Liverpool, a record store manager named Brian Epstein caught them at the Cavern Club in late 1961. He had never managed a band in his life. He was convinced they were exceptional. He spent months driving to London, knocking on doors. Columbia said no. Pi said no. Philips said no. Oriole said no. Finally, Decca Records agreed to give them a hearing. On January 1st, 1962, they arrived at Decca Studios in London, having driven through a snowstorm the night before, and barely slept. They played 15 songs for an A&R man named Mike Smith. Smith told them afterwards he couldn't see any problems. He would be in touch. Weeks later, Epstein received the verdict. Decca had decided to sign a different act, Brian Poole and the Tremolos, a local London group. The explanation delivered to Epstein was 4 words: guitar groups are finished. The executive who made that call was named Dick Rowe. He spent the rest of his life as the man who turned down the Beatles. Epstein kept pushing. He eventually got a meeting at Parlophone, a minor EMI imprint, best known at the time for comedy records. The producer there was a formerly trained musician named George Martin. Martin's first impression of the band, documented in his own memoir *All You Need Is Ears*, was cautious. He agreed to a test session, not out of conviction, but to assess what was there. During that session, he reportedly told the band's equipment roadie that he couldn't hear anything he didn't like, which was as close to enthusiasm as Martin typically offered on a first meeting. The test session became a deal, and everything that followed came from that. By the summer of 1962, the Beatles had a record contract and a drummer who would not be on it. His name was Pete Best. He had joined the band in August 1960, recruited specifically because they needed someone behind a kit for the Hamburg trip. Among fans at the Cavern Club, Best was enormously popular. Quiet, dark-haired, and striking, he received by some accounts more fan mail than the other 3 combined. What those fans did not know was that Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison had reservations about him, musically and personally. The 3 of them were tightly connected in the way that bands sometimes are, where communication becomes almost instinctive. Best was never quite part of that. He was, in Harrison's later words, slightly different from us. When George Martin heard the band in their first formal Abbey Road session in June 1962, he requested that a session drummer be used for the actual recording, a standard move at the time, but one that gave the others the opening they had been waiting for. Within weeks, the decision had been made. Best was out, and the person they had in mind to replace him was someone they already knew well from Hamburg, a drummer named Richard Starkey, who performed under the name Ringo Starr. Ringo had been playing with a Liverpool group called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Among musicians on the Liverpool scene, he was considered one of the finest drummers around, tight, reliable, musical in a way that served the song rather than showing off. He was also already a friend. On August 16, 1962, Brian Epstein called Pete Best into his office and told him he was no longer in the band. Best was devastated. He had been with them through all of it, Hamburg, The Cavern, The Decca Rejection, and now, 3 weeks before they were due to record their first proper single, it was over. Ringo's first public appearance as a Beatle was on August 18, 1962, at the Cavern Club. The crowd did not take it well. Fans who had worshipped Pete best chanted, "Pete forever, Ringo never." Ringo later described the atmosphere as riots. "A whole shouting match," he said, and he was just trying to drum. But inside the band, the difference was immediate. When Ringo sat behind the kit, something locked into place that had not been there before. The four of them, together, sounded like the band they were about to become. What followed moved faster than almost anyone was prepared for. Love Me Do reached the bottom of the British charts in late 1962. Please Please Me hit #1 in early 1963. By the end of that year, the Beatles were not merely popular, they were a phenomenon. The British press had coined a word for it, Beatlemania. The word suggests excitement. What it actually looked like, from the inside, was closer to chaos. Hotels refused bookings under real names. Airports had to be cleared. Police lines broke. On more than one occasion, the band had to be moved between venues inside ambulances because a car would have been surrounded before it could move. Their schedules were planned like military extractions. Their private lives had effectively ceased to exist. And then America. On February 9, 1964, the Beatles appeared live on The Ed Sullivan Show. An estimated 73 million Americans watched, at the time the largest single audience in U.S. television history. That number represented roughly 3/4 of every American adult sitting in front of a television that night. What happened after that was not a tour. It was a sustained emergency that lasted 2 years. American stadiums in 1964 and 1965 had no monitoring systems pointed at the stage. There was no way for the musicians to hear themselves above the crowd. The screaming at a Beatles concert was not enthusiasm layered over music. It was a wall of pure sound that completely obliterated the performance beneath it. Band members later confirmed, individually and together, that they regularly could not hear a single note they were playing. They watched each other's hands to stay in time. Lennon began playing wrong chords deliberately, changing lyrics mid-song, inserting nonsense, because nobody could hear it anyway. What nobody on the outside could see was how much this bothered them. These were not four young men who had stumbled into a pop career. They were serious musicians who had spent 3 years perfecting their craft in Hamburg. And now, at the exact height of their fame, they were performing for audiences who were not actually listening to them. Something was going to have to change. The summer of 1966 made it undeniable. In late July 1966, during the U.S. tour, the full impact of a controversy hit them that had been building since March. That spring, journalist Maureen Cleave had published a profile of John Lennon in the London Evening Standard *, the kind of long, candid interview that Lennon regularly gave to journalists he trusted. In it, he discussed religion, modern culture, and the declining influence of Christianity. He said he didn't know which would disappear first, rock and roll or Christianity. He said Jesus was all right, but his disciples were ordinary and thick, and it was the followers who had distorted the original message. And then, we're more popular than Jesus now. In Britain, the article caused almost no reaction. It was read as cultural commentary, the kind of thing that circulated in London conversation without friction. The article sat in the archives for 4 months. Then an American teen magazine called *Datebook* republished it. The editors pulled the Jesus line for their cover, and in the American South, it exploded. Radio stations across multiple southern states announced total bans on all Beatles music. DJs invited listeners to bring their records and merchandise to collection points for public destruction. Bonfires of albums were photographed and broadcast across the country. Death threats arrived at Beatles management offices. The Ku Klux Klan picketed concert venues. At one show, a firecracker was thrown toward the stage, and all 4 Beatles instinctively looked at each other, each one wondering if it had been a gunshot. At a press conference in Chicago at the start of the tour, Lennon was asked to account for himself. Photographs from that day show a man who looks genuinely shaken, which was an unusual sight for someone who had spent years being unshakable in public. He said he hadn't meant it as a boast. He wasn't anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion. He had made an observation. and he acknowledged it had come out wrong. The tour continued, but the damage, psychological, not commercial, was permanent, and it accelerated a decision that was already being made. On August 29, 1966, the Beatles performed at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. 33 minutes, 11 songs. Each member quietly brought a personal camera to the stage that night, an unspoken acknowledgement between four people who understood something the audience did not. They played the set, they walked off, they were driven directly to the airport. On the flight home, George Harrison turned to the others and said with complete calm that he was done. Not with music, with this. No announcement was ever made, no farewell statement. The biggest touring band in the world simply stopped appearing. They didn't retire, they changed where the work happened. In August 1966, with the touring finished, they walked into Abbey Road Studios and began something that had no precedent. For the first time in their career, there was no deadline driven by a tour, no need to reproduce the music live, no pressure to write songs that could be performed in a stadium by four people with guitars and a drum kit. There was just time, a studio, a producer, and the question of what they could actually do. George Martin, who wrote about this period in his memoir, All You Need Is Ears, described the sessions that followed as unlike anything he had experienced before or since. Four musicians who had spent years inside a constraint suddenly had none. The first result was Revolver *, released in August 1966. It opened with a track built on backward tape loops and distorted guitar. It closed with Tomorrow Never Knows a song built from recordings played in reverse, layered over a drone, topped by Lennon's voice fed through a rotating speaker to sound like something arriving from a great distance. Lennon told Martin he wanted the song to sound like 1,000 monks chanting on a mountaintop. Martin, who had studied classical composition, found a way to approximate it. Nothing on a pop record had sounded like it before. Then, in June 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band *. The album took 129 days to record, an almost unheard-of investment of studio time for a pop act. It was the first rock album designed as a complete artistic experience from the first track to the last, rather than a collection of potential singles. It used a full 40-piece orchestra, Indian classical instruments, and sound effects built specifically for individual tracks. The closing track, *A Day in the Life*, ended with an orchestral glissando in which Martin instructed every musician to begin at their instrument's lowest note and climb, chaotically, to the highest, culminating in a single piano chord that was allowed to decay for nearly 45 seconds. Sgt. Pepper sat at number 1 in the United Kingdom for 27 weeks, but there was a cost to this freedom that was not immediately visible. The more the Beatles changed as a creative force, the harder it became for four very different people to stay pointed in the same direction. And then, before the fractures became public, something happened that weakened the structure holding everything together. On August 27, 1967, Brian Epstein died at his London home. The cause was an accidental overdose of sleeping medication. He was 32 years old. Epstein had been their manager since 1962. He was the person who had absorbed every rejection, navigated every press crisis, and handled every aspect of the band's business life so that the four of them could focus entirely on music. He was not a perfect manager. There were financial arrangements in the early years that were not in the band's favor, but he was devoted to them in a way that went beyond professional duty. Paul McCartney later described the period immediately following Epstein's death as a time when they simply did not know what to do. The person who had handled everything that wasn't music was gone, and they had no one to replace him. They tried to replace him themselves. They launched Apple Corps, a company intended to give artists direct control over their own creative and commercial lives. The philosophy was sound, the execution was not. Money was leaving the company faster than it was arriving, and the decisions being made in the band's name were increasingly ill-considered, and the four members had begun moving in different directions that no amount of company structure could reconcile. Lennon was drifting away from the identity of Beatle towards something broader and more political. His attention had shifted, not from music, but from the band as the primary vehicle for his work. Harrison had been writing consistently excellent songs that were routinely given less studio time than Lennon and McCartney's. In interviews he gave later, including the Anthology documentary, Harrison made clear that this disparity, regardless of the quality of the songs being sidelined, had left him feeling like a secondary contributor in his own band. McCartney responded to the instability by pushing harder for structure, more rehearsals, clearer goals, which the others increasingly experienced as control rather than leadership. When the band eventually turned to a new manager after Epstein's death, the choice split them. John, George, and Ringo brought in Alan Klein, an American music executive with an aggressive reputation and a documented history of contractual disputes with the artists he represented. Paul refused to accept Klein and instead brought in his father-in-law's legal firm to represent his interests. For the first time in their history, the Beatles were not being managed by one person on behalf of four. They were being pulled in two separate legal directions simultaneously. And yet, and this is perhaps the most difficult detail of this entire story to process, the music was still extraordinary. In 1968, they began recording what would become the White Album. The sessions at Abbey Road that year were unlike anything that had come before. Tensions that had been building since Epstein's death, and probably earlier, were now visible on a daily basis. Lennon had begun bringing Yoko Ono to recording sessions, breaking an unspoken rule that the studio was a space only for the band and production staff. McCartney's tendency to take charge of arrangements was grating on the others in a way it had not before. Harrison's contributions continued to be scheduled around Lennon and McCartney's, which he documented in his autobiography I Me Mine as a source of ongoing frustration. And Ringo, who had joined the band as an outsider and spent years becoming part of its core, was feeling like an outsider again. On August 22, 1968, recording engineer Ken Scott arrived at the studio and found that Ringo was no longer there. Ringo had quit. An argument during rehearsals, the specifics of which no single account fully agrees on, had pushed him past the point where he was willing to stay. He packed his things, walked out of Abbey Road, flew to Sardinia, and borrowed Peter Sellers' yacht. He spent 2 weeks at sea. The three remaining Beatles recorded back in the USSR, without him. Each one took a turn behind the drum kit, and the finished track was assembled from different takes. It worked. But it wasn't Ringo. Eventually they sent a telegram. The exact wording has been confirmed by Ringo in multiple interviews. "You're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come on home. We love you." Ringo read it. He came back. On September 3rd, he walked into Studio 2 at Abbey Road and stopped. His drum kit, every surface, every component, right down to the kick drum pedal, had been covered in flowers. Mal Evans, the band's road manager, had arranged it with George Harrison. A small sign read, "Welcome back, Ringo." He later said it made him feel good about himself again. The public had no idea any of it had happened. The greatest band in the world, from the outside, looked exactly as it always had. What was happening inside was something else entirely. In January 1969, the plan was to film a documentary. The idea was to capture the band returning to its live roots, rehearsing new material on camera, letting the cameras see the creative process, and ending the project with a concert. It had the potential to be a reminder of where they had come from and proof that they were still, despite everything, a functioning band. The rehearsals were filmed at Twickenham Film Studios and then moved to their own Apple Studios on Savile Row. The cameras recorded what was actually happening in the room. Arguments about songs, arguments about direction, arguments about whether there was still a direction at all. George Harrison walked out of one session entirely, telling the others he was leaving the band. He was persuaded to return a few days later. The concert idea proved impossible to agree on. A stadium was considered, then an amphitheater in Libya, then various indoor venues. Every suggestion died in the room. Eventually, Paul McCartney suggested they should just find somewhere they weren't supposed to be, set up and play before anyone could stop them. What they settled on was the roof. At approximately noon on January 30th, 1969, the Beatles climbed to the roof of their Apple Corps building at 3 Savile Row in London's West End. They were joined by keyboardist Billy Preston, who had been sitting in on the Apple sessions. The film's director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, had positioned cameras on the roof, across the street, at street level, and in the reception below. They plugged in, they started playing. On Savile Row below, the lunch hour came to a stop. People walking past slowed, then halted. Music was coming from above, in the middle of a working afternoon in central London, and it was unmistakably the Beatles. Word passed through the surrounding streets without any announcement. People climbed onto neighboring roofs, traffic stopped moving. Office workers pressed against windows. The Metropolitan Police received calls from nearby businesses within minutes. Officers arrived at the Apple reception and were initially refused entry by staff. When the staff were informed that refusal constituted obstruction, they stepped aside. The officers were escorted to the roof, where they stood at the edge of the performance and waited for an opportunity to stop it. The Beatles played 5 songs, 9 takes in total, 42 minutes. Near the end, as the officers stepped closer and the performance was clearly about to be halted, McCartney reached the final verse of Asterisk, Get Back Asterisk, and changed the lyric. You've been playing on the rooftops again, and you know your mama doesn't like it. She's gonna have you arrested. Ringo later admitted he had genuinely wanted to be arrested. He thought it would make a perfect ending to the film. It didn't happen. The police asked them, politely, to stop. The performance ended. John Lennon stepped to his microphone. He looked at the cameras, the officers, the small cold crowd still on the roof, and said, I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition. The people on the street below did not know what they had just heard. Nobody told them. The rooftop concert at 3 Savile Row on January 30th, 1969 was the final public performance of the Beatles, and then they made one more album. This is the detail that makes the whole story almost impossible to believe, that in the summer of 1969, with legal proceedings underway, with the personal relationships in various states of damage, with each of the 4 already doing work outside the band, they came back to Abbey Road and made Asterisk, Abbey Road Asterisk. George Martin returned as producer. He had been largely sidelined during the Asterisk, Get Back Asterisk sessions, but he agreed to come back on one condition: full creative authority in the studio, the way it had always been. The band agreed. The album, released in September 1969, contained Asterisk, Come Together Asterisk, Asterisk Something Asterisk, Asterisk Here Comes the Sun Asterisk, and a side 2 medley that wove 17 minutes of unfinished song fragments into a continuous suite. In his memoir, McCartney described recording it with the knowledge that it was probably the last thing they would make together. It debuted at number 1 and stayed there for 11 weeks. 1 month after the album's release, John Lennon sat down with the other 3 and told them he wanted a divorce. He used that specific word. The others talked him out of making the announcement public while certain business contracts were still being finalized. Lennon agreed, but only reluctantly. On April 10, 1970, Paul McCartney issued a press release alongside his first solo album. In it, he confirmed that he had no plans to write with John Lennon, that his differences with the other Beatles were personal and musical, and that he did not know when, if ever, the band would record again. The following morning's newspapers reduced it to a single line: Paul quits the Beatles. The reaction from the public was, by nearly every account, something closer to grief than disappointment. Not the manageable sadness of a favorite artist changing direction, something more like a piece of the world going quiet. Letters arrived in thousands. Radio stations dropped their schedules and played Beatles records for hours. People who had never met any of them felt, somehow, as though a loss had occurred in their own lives. The Beatles ended, not because the talent disappeared, not because the music stopped being good, not because the world stopped listening, but because 4 people had arrived, separately and by different paths, at a point where the band itself could no longer hold them. The last album released under their name was Asterisk Let It Be Asterisk in May 1970. It contained the rooftop footage, it contained the arguments, it contained the music they had made while everything around them was coming apart. The story of the Beatles is not a story about a rise followed by a fall. It is a story about 4 people who were told they had no future, who proved that wrong so completely that the world ran out of ways to describe them, and who eventually found that what they had built together was both the most important thing in their lives and the thing that could no longer contain them. The fact that it happened at all, that four young men from a port city in the north of England became what they became, is still one of the strangest things that has ever occurred in the history of popular music. And the fact that we are still talking about it says everything you need to know about what they left behind.